All right, everybody, how's it going? Welcome to another episode of Tony Talks. We're coming at you with episode 23 on this May the 4th, 2020. May the 4th be with you. Today's guest on the program is Dr. Cynthia McKinney, the first black woman to be elected to Georgia's House of Representatives. She was the 2008 Green Party candidate for president. She's the author of several books, including The Illegal War on Libya, Ain't Nothing Like Freedom, and When China Sneezes, From the Wuhan Lockdown to the Global Political and Economic Implications. Not listed here is that she was also the first candidate for president that I actually voted for back in 2008, and she might be the next candidate I vote for in 2020. Who knows? Keep an eye out for her name in the news. Maybe she'll be running for president in 2020, and let's give her a vote. She has the official Tony Talks endorsement if she chooses to do that. Make sure you look her up on Facebook and on Twitter, Cynthia McKinney, Ph.D. We had a great discussion about everything that's going on from the powers that be, how they're using the coronavirus to potentially take away civil liberties, and what the implications of all this really means for our freedoms and for the future, really. Also talked a lot about third-party politics. And, it was really very educational, especially for myself. I learned a lot. I hope you guys learn a lot. And remember, Tony Talks 8 on Instagram, and also Tony Talks 8 podcast at gmail.com for all email inquiries. All right, here comes the intro. Enjoy the show, and I'll talk to you next time.
I'll make a brand new start of it in old New York.
How are you holding up with everything as far as just on a personal level with the pandemic and all that stuff?
Well, like my mom she went out of the house. She's been out of the house 3 times in whenever this started. So that's kind of weird. But other than that, I started doing something that I needed to have done a long time ago. So I started taking morning walks. And it's been beautiful. It's been great for just getting my natural vitamin D. And then, of course, communing with nature. And it really is more natural, or at least it was. Georgia now is opened up. But before, at the very beginning, you can still hear the birds singing. And the air was clean. I mean, you could just feel the difference. It was as if Earth was allowed finally to breathe. And it was wonderful.
Yeah, that's something that they've been saying, is that the air quality, and I don't know how they measure it and everything, but the CO2 levels have all gone through a cleansing period because there are less cars on the road and there are just less O2 emissions coming from people in general. Just crazy.
Well, I believe that. And just imagine that this is a global phenomenon because countries all over the world are shut down. In fact, the country in which I work and have my job and teach is now shut down. So now I'm also on my walks, I'm contemplating, okay, well, now what does this actually mean for me in terms of my livelihood? Am I going to go back? I teach in Asia. So
Right.
Am I going to go back, or am I staying here? My mother is enjoying having me here. So it's opened up a new way of thinking, or a different way of thinking, or a different way of being. And I think we needed that. We don't need this virus, but we definitely needed to take a pause and figure some things out. And I'm hoping that the powers that be are exposing themselves to the extent that now we see that the United States in general had become a swamp, and all of the swamp needed to be drained, whether it's healthcare, big pharma, big tech, Of course, in the political system, that was a swamp, but education, a swamp. And so um, you could say that the pollution that existed in the political system had extended so far across every aspect of life in the United States that hopefully people are awakened and now they understand that the swamp is pervasive, it needs to be drained, and the only way it's going to get drained is for actually us to do it.
Right. And you're starting to see people were more or less going along with what the government was saying early on. But now, as the numbers are coming out more and more, and they're seeing there could have been even more and more people infected with it, and they weren't, the death rate or whatever, severe infections weren't as high as they thought it was. People are saying, okay, that's enough. Let's get back to work at a much higher scale than what originally thought. In a state like Georgia, so is Georgia like opened up like 100% now, or is it like gradual?
It's basically there is no stay-at-home order, and because I think that expired April 30th, and so now it's basically open, except that it is in phases like with restrictions, so that so-called social distancing is practiced, and people are wearing a mask or whatever. So it's open. You could say it's open with what I want to, with some
Some general
provisions, extra
guidelines.
provisions.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Texas is doing something
Yeah.
similar now too. They were you're wearing a mask in public, but
Mm-hmm.
there's, I think the governor came out and he said, when you go to the supermarket, you see people standing 6 feet apart. Why can't we just do that in more places? So, um, interesting to
Right.
see how
That's right.
how that'll come
That's right.
out, how those numbers will come out in the next couple of weeks. And hopefully, there's not another spike or whatever. It's just it's just been crazy, and you just see how delicate society is with something like this coming along. It could just shut everything down, and it's alarming to say the least.
Well, it's alarming until you become informed,
Mm-hmm.
and then you understand a little bit better what's going on. And the way to become informed is not by listening to the television and the mainstream. You can't listen to corporate funded media, whether it's print um, or radio or television. You or foundation funded. It's the same thing. So basically, once you get outside of those kinds of outlets, and then you become a part of the alternative media world, it's easier to find um, somewhat more of a semblance of factual information from which you can make your own decision. So basically, let me tell you where I am now, what I'm doing now, and sort of how that came to be. So if you'll remember, in that other world before there was a COVID-19, if you can even remember that there ever was another such world, well, the drums of war were beating inside the United States with propaganda at the highest level against China. And so basically what I wanted to do, which is what I generally do, is if I see the propaganda and the war drums are beating, then I try to get to that place so I can understand what the truth is. So this time, I didn't go by myself. Well, actually, I rarely go by myself. I am able to join with other curious people. So I organized a delegation. It's sort of like a fact-finding mission of 20 people, 18 from the US and 2 were from the UK. And we decided that we would go to China and we would learn the truth about what was happening over there. Remember, there were all of the allegations about the Uyghur community, which is the non-Han Muslim community, and that they were being locked up and imprisoned and sent to re-education camps, blah, 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 all of that. And of course, the United States has no room at all to criticize anyone, but if there is a human rights crisis, then I want to know about it.
Right.
So
this was pre-COVID?
I organized this delegation, found 20 people who were willing to, this is pre-COVID. So found 20 people who were, well, actually, as it turns out, it was post-COVID, but that's another story. Found 20 people who were willing to pay their own way and go and spend 2 weeks over in China. So we basically organized the delegation to begin right after Christmas, December 2019. And we went there, we left January 10th, I believe, was the very last day of our delegation. As you might remember, January 20th was the beginning of the lockdown.
Exactly.
So while we went there for one reason, what ended up happening was that we all, of course, I believe, it's dead of winter, and I believe that we were the very last tourist group that was traveling inside China from the US and the UK. We started out in Beijing, which is equivalent to starting out in, say, Washington, D.C., New York. And then from Beijing, we went into 2 other cities in the sort of like their Midwest, our Midwest. And then we ended up in the Uyghur Autonomous Province, which is in the West, which is sort of equivalent to like our Portland or something. So you could say that we traversed the country, and we did not go to Wuhan. That was not one of the stops on our tour. We were mainly interested in the Muslim areas, what it was like to live in China as a Muslim, whether you were in Xinjiang or not. And so
you were there on a humanitarian
that was
mission.
Basically the focus.
And
Yes,
then all
that's
this
right.
coronavirus stuff happens coincidentally at the same time.
And then all the coronavirus stuff happened, right? And so then, of course, now when we returned, we were very excited because we were going to write a book about our experiences and our findings. And of course, we still need to do that. But then, like 10 days later, so we're planning the book for the initial 10 days that we're here. And then all of a sudden, oh my gosh, the dam breaks. And so then my focus shifted to coronavirus. And so now I am in the process of putting together a book about what has happened in the world, or what the entire world now understands is going on. But there's still so much to the story that is unknown. So the name of the book is When China Sneezes: From the Wuhan Lockdown to the Global Politico-Economic Implications. And I'm so proud that, of course, now when you start talking about international relations, security studies, hybrid warfare, biological warfare, any of any kind of warfare, then that's my thing, and I'm very comfortable with that. But here we were trying to put together, or I was trying to put together a book that needed to have a different kind of expertise. So I needed medical expertise. And thank goodness I was able to find people who were willing to contribute to the book. So we start out and we basically are discussing the, sort of like the simple things. What is coronavirus? We
Hmm.
start really simply, but then it immediately escalates, like in chapter 2, we have to discuss what's going on at these US funded level 3 and level 4 bio labs all over the world. US taxpayers are financing or supporting these level 3, level 4 bio labs in other countries. And why is the United States doing that? And what kind of research is taking place there? These are things that, of course, I believe the people of the US need to know, because I'm not in favor of any kind of censorship anyway in the first place. And the secret government, I'm not in favor of any of that. If it's paid for with US tax dollars, then US people ought to have a right to know. So anyway, we go into that, and then we look at some curious outbreaks like SARS, like MERS, like Zika. And we have a gentleman who actually lives in China, a US citizen, but he lives in China, and he contributed greatly to our understanding of these quote unquote unusual outbreaks. Then we get into the the
Is there is there any
lockdown.
is there any
Uh-huh.
point in the book where you discuss a theory on the origin of COVID-19 specifically? Because that's something that still seems to be nobody has any idea where that comes from. There's no patient zero, so to say.
Yes, of course. And so that's exactly where we go next. And that chapter, we have a chapter, Patient Zero, Ground Zero. But the bottom line is we don't know ground zero and we don't know patient zero. So now, why is it that we don't know patient zero and we don't know ground zero? Is it because of incompetence, or is it because of some intentionality? And I, would just ask the members of your audience to think about that. In the past, when things have happened that are of deep state origin, like, for example, the murder of our president in 1963, we basically were given a line as to who did it, and then there was successive eliminations of witnesses, and, or I should say counter witnesses, and of the accused himself. The story about the accused doesn't even add up. And so uh, when it comes to ground zero, well, we kind of know ground zero, but we don't know the ground zero of the planning. And we don't know who actually did the planning. So whenever there's this kind of lack of information, we can go straight down the list, since I can do the political side of things. If we go straight down the list of the Martin Luther King's assassination, we go through that whole decade of assassinations, and we have a ground zero, but we don't have a culprit zero. We don't have it, but we do know we have a little bit
There's
that was unexpected,
there's
because it was
pieces of
United
the
States
puzzle that
government.
aren't there.
Huh?
There's pieces of the puzzle that are missing. You see what happened at the end, but you don't see any of the planning that went forth to the people who ended up perpetrating the assassination. Is that
That's
correct?
right, because because of tremendous work of William Pepper and the trial that was held in 1999, we know that the United States government conspired, created a conspiracy to actually carry out the killing of Dr. King. But who inside the government? How high did it go? We don't know that.
Well, look at Operation.
And that's intentionally.
Sorry to cut you off. I think there's a little lag, but Operation Northwoods, I think, is something appropriate to bring up right now. That went all the way up to the Joint Chiefs of Staff's desk before it got shut down, where they actually had plans to stage an invasion of Cuba, and it involved killing actual American citizens and making them look like the Cubans did it. Am I out of tone speaking on that?
No, you're absolutely right. So, the reason that we don't yet have a patient zero or ground zero, is it intentionality or is it incompetence? And the people of the United States should not pay for either one of them, but we do. So then from there, we go to what China's response was, and then what it was like to live through the lockdown. And little did we know at the time that we were planning this book that all of us were going to be able to write a lockdown diary. But I've got a few, and they're kind of short, lockdown diaries from people inside China, U.S. citizen inside China, U.S. citizen who's a student over there, but who was locked out of China. So, it sort of went both ways. And a Chinese citizen who was a part of, who was locked down. And then I have an African citizen who's living in China who was also a part of the lockdown. So I've got some, sort of interesting insight into
a broad
these different
background.
Communities and what it's like. Yes. And then we get into the economic impact. So what's the economic impact in China? What's the global economic impact? What's the U.S. impact? The impact on the U.S. economy. So as much of that is still unfolding, but luckily I was able to get some internationally renowned economists to agree to provide chapters in the book. And so I've received a few of those chapters and waiting for a couple more to come in. And then the final chapter, the final part of the book is what I do, and it's inside my area of expertise. And so it's about hybrid warfare and bio warfare in particular. So we've got an excursion into DARPA that is one of the chapters, and then we've got the development of these ethnic specific viruses. That's my chapter, and I've already written my chapter, and it's going to be, I think, maybe when I was writing it would have been a bombshell, but I think it might be less of a bombshell now that more things are coming out. And also, how do we know that this is hybrid warfare? Because of the propaganda. So we have to deal with the propaganda aspect of what's going on in our world now. And the propaganda aspect is so important.
Just to define, like, hybrid warfare, that's it. What we're looking at is a warfare that's both from the media perspective and the bio warfare, and that creates the hybrid.
Well, the hybrid warfare is actually a term that describes warfare that is everything except hot or kinetic, as Obama said with respect to what was going on in Libya, the destruction of Libya. So it's everything except kinetic. And by kinetic, I mean that, you're not dropping bombs. Mm-hmm. So one doctor put it brilliantly, and I'm going to use this when I write the introduction to the book. I just heard this yesterday. he said that the battlefield now has moved to the bloodstream.
Wow. Yeah,
Yeah,
that
that's
makes
right.
it's accurate too because of all the solutions that are coming out to combat this thing, let alone beating the virus, but proving that you're safe from the virus, whether it be having vaccine records that you carry on your phone or just different things like that that really infringe on personal liberties.
That's exactly right. And so now that, and so, we're building up so in the book, we're literally building up to the culminating point of, well, what's the point of all of this?
Hmm.
And
Sorry.
that's the last chapter, written by a journalist who works with Russia Today. And basically, you could say that these deep state players have revealed their hand when they start talking about universal vaccines, ID 2020, putting in a digital ID inside the vaccine. And I mean, you remember Nancy Pelosi put the digital wallet inside the coronavirus bill. And, so things are being revealed now. And so now we are beginning to understand that there was indeed an agenda that has been made possible by the appearance of COVID-19. And that agenda is, there's an attempt to push that agenda through before people wise up and see just exactly that it is an agenda that has nothing to do with dampening down on COVID-19, but has everything to do with dampening down on your constitutional rights and the Bill of Rights.
Yeah. So the thing is, will people go along with this? And a certain segment of the population will probably run to get their chip if it means that they, or whatever medium they're going to use to enforce this. With your papers, please, pretty much, if you get pulled over, if you need to cross state lines or get on a plane or anywhere where the public congregates, what the people's reaction will be if and when something like that ultimately gets enforced, because it certainly looks like we are moving in that direction, which is scary. And it's something that was, if you said this 10 years ago, you were looked at like crazy.
That's
but,
right.
but now it's like, hello.
And this is what I was talking to someone about yesterday, is that so after Pearl Harbor, there was the ease with which the United States entered World War II was facilitated. After the murder of President Kennedy, these interminable wars were facilitated, and U.S. participation in the international drug trade was facilitated. Things that you would never have thought possible of your government suddenly, all of a sudden, became quote unquote normal or normalized as a result of these quote unquote Pearl Harbor moments. After September 11th, the Patriot Act was just sitting there waiting to be passed into law. The very things that Senator Frank Church, who was investigating COINTELPRO and other abuses by the U.S. intelligence agencies, well, the things that he said were illegal and un-American became legal, still un-American in my opinion, with the passage of the Patriot Act.
Absolutely.
So
It seems
these
like
these
there's
things
these,
allow
it's
a,
like
a
opportunistic. Sorry. It seems like it's very opportunistic. However you think these things came into existence, there's these events that are being used to push something, and it should be called, I think, opportunistic. It's like,
yes, yes, it's opportunistic corruption, or if we're going to stay in the medical field, these are opportunistic infections. And so now we find that our entire body politic, our entire political system, our entire way of life, whether it's education, healthcare, you name it, has been infected. These are opportunistic infections, and they have just spread throughout our entire being as individuals living in the United States.
Right. And this is the line that's going to have people are going to have to decide what's the line that you don't cross. And like there's certainly a segment of the population that's already drawn that line. But with the country being so divided as it is right now, it'll be interesting to see how the public responds to this. How do you think, or what do you think President Trump, his role in this has been, and what's your opinion on how he stands? Is he just serving the big, the deep state, or what's your thoughts on that?
Well, Trump gave us the language. He has said nothing more than I said many, many years ago when I was under attack. But, I wasn't a white male billionaire, so I didn't have much, what can I say, much heft or much authority with which to, or respected authority, with which to provide a critique of the U.S. political system. But so he says that the system is rigged. Remember, candidate Trump said the system is rigged. Well, now people know that the system really is rigged. Wow, yeah, it really is rigged. And now what I add to that is not only is the system rigged, but in order for us to accept a rigged system as something that's normal, it means that we had to be rigged too. So the people were rigged to allow a system that's rigged. And now, how do we get rid of the system that's rigged? We have to unrig the system. But before we can unrig the system, we have to unrig ourselves. And some of that rigging has been in existence for hundreds of years. So when you start talking about race in the United States, for example, you talk about gender in the United States. You talk about ethnicity in the United States. These are conversations that have also been a part of the rigging. And so
it's causing more division.
Well, the rigging was the dividing.
Right, that's what I meant.
Because if you look at the work of Theodore Allen, and basically it's Dr. Jeffrey Perry who gives us all of the work of Theodore Allen. In his tome, it's 2-part volume, The Invention of the White Race. So basically what you learn is that in the early United States, there were European Americans, and so they were German Americans, they were Irish Americans, they were this American, they were that American, and basically they were of their European
I see.
stock.
Yes, I've heard this. Yeah, they were separate, but then you just kind of, because everybody looked close enough alike, you create white.
Well, now,
No?
but there was a purpose in that.
Right.
So
Okay.
what was the catalyzing event? The catalyzing event was when those European workers, those European descendant workers, decided to ally with the black labor. So you had white labor and black labor joined together. And that was the beginning of the white race. If you look at U.S. history, So there was no such thing as a white person, because that was not the way the delineations went.
Mm-hmm.
And so basically what you had was the creation of a white race in order to allow the 1%, if we use the language of the Occupy movement, in order to allow the 1% to continue to prevail. Because if you had white workers joining with black workers, then they were going to attack the 1%.
So that's the division.
So race, ethnicity, gender, all of that became a methodology of social control. And Dr. Jeffrey Perry spells it out. I encourage your audience to go to his website, jeffreyperry.net, and you can find all of this documented history about how this came to being. And so it is Dr. Perry's thesis that in order for us to do the unrigging that is necessary, this is an important aspect of the unrigging of ourselves that has to take place.
That's really, it makes perfect sense when you put it like that. And that's Jeffrey Perry and
Jeffrey Perry.
Peter Allen. So that's kind of falls into the whole divide and control. And it's like I like to say things like, or I don't know, what I put in perspective is there's classes of society, and there's a top class that doesn't care how the bottom classes are controlled, as long as they're controlled. And using race, gender, whatever, political belief even, it's another thing. It's a perfect way for us to self-police each other.
Exactly. And so then you have these artificial lanes that are created. And so then, you don't step in my lane and da. And
when
so
it's all created. It's all
exactly.
That's
right.
This is stuff that I've thought about, but hearing you put it in actual studies that have been put into place on it, it's really everybody should know about this, and everybody needs to look into this, because the more we look at each other as we're so different from each other, the easier it makes the game to be rigged. And that's the unrigging
exactly
that you're
right.
talking about, is breaking through those layers and saying, hey, you and I are more close or more the same than we think. And sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so we've got Dr. Jeffrey Perry, who took the unique situation of the United States, and as chronicled by Theodore Allen, whose work he championed. So it's really Theodore Allen who lived a lifetime of observing this strategy unfold, and the implementation of the strategy that allows the 1/10 of the 1% to prevail. And then you have another professor. His name is Anibal Quijano, and Anibal Quijano, Anibal Quijano.
So glad you spelled that out.
And so what he does is he looks at the Americas, particularly Latin America, but not just Latin America, because he's also looking at the Americas and the indigenous peoples from the beginning of the colonial period, and how he has a thesis of coloniality of power, and how even today, he just recently died, I think it was in 2020 that he died, but his coloniality of power goes right through from the 1600s right up to 2020. And so that's another way, or an extension of this idea of the system being rigged. Well, it's been rigged for a very long time. It's been rigged ever since the 1600s. And there were various ways in which it was rigged. There were various peoples who came over. So now I'm talking about the Spaniards, the British, the French, who played a role in colonizing Latin America and the Caribbean. So the Dutch included in that. So you've got all of this quote unquote rigging that's going on that produces the world as we know it in 2020 or 2016, if you want to take it up to that. So there's a lot of rigging that's been going on. There's a lot of narratives that have now been written and that are recognized as really excellent explanations
right.
for the lives that we live, as opposed to the life as it ought to be lived. And one of the things that I think we're also seeing is the normalization of the centralization of the level of control on a global scale by this 1/10 of the 1%. And that then makes it even more difficult when you introduce technology into this. It makes it more difficult for us to fight back, but the technology can generally cut both ways. And so we can also utilize technology, old technology as well as new technology, but with an idea toward unrigging ourselves and unrigging the system.
So how would you say it's just educate yourself? Just the best thing you could do is to look into, these brilliant minds that you just talked about, and grassroots, that's how the best way to go about unrigging the system is? Or would, getting the appropriate people in office? And I want to ask you something about the Democratic primaries in a second, but would you say that would be like the most optimal way? Because it's getting to a point where it's like, what do we do about this? There's so much information out there and we're able to collect it, but like, how do we take first steps to see through the man behind the curtain, so to say?
Well, since I am sort of trying to figure out my own future in terms of, because
I'm asking you to solve the problems for us right now on Tony Talks. You have the answers.
And I'm trying to solve my own problem right now. But what I give my students is a heavy dose of Paulo Freire, who is a contemporary of Frantz Fanon. So Frantz Fanon wrote first, and then Paulo Freire is in Brazil, and he's reading Frantz Fanon and said, "Oh my gosh, this is absolutely correct." But what Paulo Freire does in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, you have to get through the entire book, but at the very end, he gives us the mechanisms of oppression and the tools for liberation. So he gives us conquest and divide and rule and now cultural invasion as methodologies that have been used as this method of social control that end up oppressing people. And then he says, well, we also have methodologies for liberation, for self-liberation. And what are they? Unity, collaboration, and social and cultural synthesis. Now, what does he mean by this? Well, basically what he means is that, okay, we've got the things that they do. And I think we all know the things that they do. Divide and rule, manipulation, those are the big ones. cultural invasion, that's another big one. But then what we have to do is we have to create a new culture. We have to, where they create a culture of control and oppression, we have to create a culture of liberation. We have to create a culture of freedom. And so we must not ever allow any entity to have the level of control over us that denies us freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, freedom of thought, basic human rights. And I would say in the US context, the Bill of Rights. So as when we see affronts, like for example, the Patriot Act, to these rights, we have to fight them. And if we have people in office who don't represent those values, then we need to take them out. Now, let me just tell you what the power of propaganda is. Let me go to my Twitter, and actually it's still up here. I need to take it down. But yesterday it was May 2nd to May 3rd. So yesterday the results came in. I asked a question: what kind of leadership would you rather have? Do you want the kind of leadership that is being picked for you by the deep state? Or do you want authentic, proven, community-tested leadership that is loyal to you? And then the third choice I gave, though, was, do you know the difference?
People don't
Guess
know the difference.
What? 42%. I did this on Facebook and Facebook as well. 42% of those on the Twitter responded that they didn't know, they couldn't tell the difference. So propaganda is effective, and it's so effective that people don't know who their real, authentic, proven, community-tested leaders are versus deep state provided leaders.
Would you consider Joe Biden being a deep state?
Absolutely.
And let me ask you real quick about, because the Democratic primary came down. We got Joe Biden as the presumptive nominee, if not the nominee already. I'm not 100% sure if he got the delegates yet, but we know it's going to be him. The Democratic Party has been criticizing the Republicans, or Trump for that matter, on his pretty much dense beliefs, on racial issues, and he sees things through a certain lens. So the party that's been championing itself as the party of diversity gave you 78-year-old Joe Biden, 77-year-old Bernie Sanders, 77-year-old Mike Bloomberg as their most electable nominees, and buried the candidates. Like I liked Tulsi Gabbard a lot. Candidates that would be a different perspective just based on their culture and plus military service and everything else. Not even looking at the platforms. They gave you an image of more of the same when it came down to it. And then gave you Joe Biden, who has sexual assault allegations, which is another thing they were criticizing Trump on. I'm just asking for your thoughts on that.
It was 2008.
That's when you ran.
When I declared my independence from the national leadership that had provided us the wars that had maimed our people and people in various other countries around the world. So I just was done. And people, I don't know, the Democratic Party has not changed. So So since the Democratic Party hasn't changed, and it has become a more warlike, whenever Trump talks about bringing the troops out of Germany, bringing the troops out, what has NATO done for us lately, bringing the troops out of Afghanistan, and whenever he talks about that, it's Democrats that are up in arms and saying,
right.
So, I mean, the Democrats have become the party of war, the party of division, the party of, and sadly, maybe they always were the party of war and I just didn't realize it. It could be, I just, didn't understand it, but I think it's very clear now. So the Democratic Party, I believe, just, no longer represents my values, and they don't represent the values of a whole lot of people. So why stick with the Democratic Party?
Why not have a third party where we have somebody like, I don't know, Jesse Ventura and yourself lead the charge, and maybe have all the third parties unite underneath you two at the top or something like that?
Well, the Green Party does cooperate when it comes to questions of ballot access. So we cooperate with other parties that are similarly locked out. And I filed a lawsuit with the Constitution Party for presidential candidates, and now I provided an affidavit for the Green Party that is now in litigation about its congressional candidates. So you've got the situation where these other parties are locked out. If you had Jesse Ventura, who I believe is extremely popular, he enjoys the kind of popularity that Ralph Nader had. And if you had Jesse actually say, I'm going to run, I believe, and he's expressed interest in the Green Party. In fact, I just received somebody sent me a photograph of him joining the Green Party. So now he is a Green. That's wonderful. So if you had Jesse Ventura running, I believe that after Bernie's perfidy for the second time around, endorsing the Democratic nominee, I believe that you have a lot of people who were Bernie supporters who will look very closely at a Jesse Ventura-led Green Party.
Would that be something that would interest you? Or
Absolutely, 100%, absolutely.
do you think it's possible there could be, because sometimes you walk into the voting booth, and you see the Republicans have like 6 other parties, whether it's, Conservative Party, you see the name pop up 6 different times, or you see the Democrats have the Democrat Working Families, whatever, Liberal Party.
Mm-hmm.
Would it be plausible for the big third parties, Green, Libertarian, Constitution, Independent, to have a joint venture? Because when it comes down to it, unless to get like percentage points to really start, having an impact on the election, maybe that's the best way to do it.
Well, it definitely makes sense, and it is a position that I have advocated for ever since 2008. So it is possible. That would be a project that I would love to work on, because I believe that the time has come for all of us to, we have shared values and we have shared oppression. As long as the duopoly rules, then anyone who thinks differently, there's no place for you in the political system now. So by cooperating, we can provide space for everybody else. That's got to be a winner.
Right. That could have like a big, especially if somebody like Ron Paul got involved too
Yes.
as an
Well, remember
advisor.
in 2008,
Yeah.
it was Ron Paul who actually brought us all together and everybody came on board except the Constitution Party.
Was
But
it
I think that would be not
libertarian?
no, yeah, libertarian, yeah, with Bob Barr. But I think that would change. In fact, I'm absolutely certain that would change with the, well, it's not necessarily the new leadership. There is somewhat new leadership of the Libertarian Party, but you've had a huge infusion of young people with the candidacy of Adam Kokesh. And of course, I like Adam as well. And so I would love to work for Adam. I would love for him to win the nomination for the Libertarian Party. And if Jesse would actually run under the Green banner, I am absolutely certain that you would see that kind of fusion take place.
And that might be the best.
And it's important for me to add that what I'm discussing is the possibility of fusion without the loss of one's identity. So the political identity of a party is important, and its adherents need to see themselves reflected in the fusion.
That's an excellent point. And I think in 2008, you guys united behind, there were 4 key tenets pretty much that are pretty big deals, but neither the Republicans or Democrats were talking about. But you guys stood behind and said, this is where we could get our support behind. This is where we could, really drive to change. And, pretty much the Republicans and Democrats ignored, have continued to ignore those 4 tenets. But that was a no increase in national debt, thorough audit of the Fed, safeguard of civil liberties, and end of the wars.
Okay, so you see the wars have escalated.
Mm-hmm. Well, the Fed was audited, I believe.
What? Sorry, I didn't get that.
Was there an audit of the Fed?
Yes, there was an audit of the Fed. And that would not have happened without Rand Paul. So, and yesterday was World Journalism Day. Was it yesterday? No, it was the day before yesterday. It was World Journalism Day. And we talked about, on that day, we talked about Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. Rand Paul's the only one who's talking about that. So it seems that we have 100 people elected, but we only have 1 senator.
That's a good way to put it. I know you said you have 60 minutes, and we're right at the time. It's been just about an hour. And I know you have your book coming out that you're editing and adding to. That's, I believe, coming out in the fall this year, When China Sneezes. And you also have another book,
that's correct.
Ain't Nothing Like Freedom, is another title that you published a few years ago. If people haven't checked it out, check it out.
And the illegal war against Libya.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's anything else you want to put out, or if anything else that you want to champion real fast, but this has been hugely, I think this has been very educational, especially for me.
Oh, okay. Well, I would just like to ask your audience to please join me on social media. I'm there on Twitter at Cynthia McKinney. I'm in, well, when I'm not in Facebook prison, I'm on Facebook.
That means you're doing something right.
Yeah. So yeah, just join me and become a part of the conversation.
Absolutely. Perfect way to put it. I'm so glad you came on, and I'm so glad we're able to do this.
Well, thank you so much for asking me.
Brand new start of it in